in being part of us. So join us. You can go to our website at mdhadallas.org and hit the donate button and become monthly recurring sponsors of MDHA. So now I want to hand it off to Ian, who's going to do an intro. Ian is the president of Luma Residential, as well as Apartment Association of Greater Dallas. Luma Residential is a private multifamily investment and property management firm based in Dallas with communities across Texas. Ian, your turn.
Thank you so much, Nissi. I couldn't be more pleased to represent the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas today in tackling this important, hard conversation. The members of the Apartment Association of Greater Dallas collectively own and manage more than 300,000 rental units across North Texas. And while the few thousand luxurious, glamorous, high-rise and mid-rise suburban communities and downtown properties often get most of the press, the vast majority of our members cater to the individuals and families, much like those that we'll be discussing today. And all too often, we've seen the impact of negative stereotyping about poverty that has had on our residents in their daily lives. And that's why I'm so glad to introduce Dr. Hannah Leibovitz, who will be guiding our discussion today about what America gets wrong about poverty. Dr. Leibovitz is a professor of public affairs and planning at the University of Texas at Arlington, where her research focuses on local governance, community development, and environmental justice, among other things. She received both her master's and her PhD from Cleveland State University, and she's been widely published in a wide array of publications, including the Journal of Public and Nonprofit Affairs, City Lab, and The Forward, among others. Welcome to Dr. Leibovitz.
Hi, thank you. So happy to be here today. So I guess we're going to jump in with Dr. Rank. Dr. Rank, you can join us so I can introduce you and we can get started here. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And please note that we will be having a question and answer session at the end. So as you're listening, thinking through things, hold on to those questions and bring them up towards the end. So Dr. Rank is the Herbert S. Hadley Professor of Social Welfare in the George Warren Brown School of Social Work at Washington University, WashU, in St. Louis. He is widely recognized as one of the foremost experts on issues of poverty, inequality, and social justice. He has been the recipient of many awards, and his research has been reported in a wide range of media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and NPR. Thank you so much, Dr. Rank, for being here today.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you. So today we're talking about the book that Dr. Rank just co-authored, Poorly Understood: What America Gets Wrong About Poverty. Dr. Rank, to start us off, can you help us understand the motivation that you had in writing this book?
Sure. And before I even start that, I wanted to thank David, Nissi, and Ian for sponsoring this and putting this together. So I'm really grateful to them for doing this. The motivation behind the book was I was in my office one day and I was talking to one of my co-authors, and we were saying, there really isn't a book that has addressed all of these myths and stereotypes surrounding poverty, homelessness, inequality. And we thought, that would be a really interesting idea for a book. And so we kind of sat down and wrote down some of those myths, and that was basically the origin of the book. And I've been doing research on poverty and inequality for a long period of time, and routinely run into all of these misperceptions and stereotypes. And so this is a book that really takes on, each chapter kind of takes on one of those myths and stereotypes and really addresses it with research and empirical evidence.
And Dr. Rank, what do you think is the most burning issue that your book addresses? So not just about poverty more generally, but what's the biggest myth that you wanted to push up against?
That's a really good question. And I would say there certainly are lots of myths that we talk about, but I would say the one that really underlies a lot of misperceptions in America is the idea that poverty is the result of individual failing. And in fact, we often view in this country social problems as the result of individual failing. That is, there's something wrong with the person, they're not working hard enough, they're not motivated enough, and so on. And what we show in the book is that really, if we talk about poverty or these social problems, poverty to a large extent is a structural failing. It has to do with not enough jobs that pay a decent wage. It has to do with social programs that do not support folks. And so I would say that that's probably the biggest overall myth, is that in this country, we're so rooted in the idea of rugged individualism. And in fact, I had a book last year that came out that was dealing with this. And the way that we're very much steeped in this idea that you do it on your own, you make it on your own, you don't rely on others. And that really clouds how we view a lot of these social issues, and in particular, the issue of poverty.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about the book is this idea that sort of poverty should be an assumed state, that most people are probably going to experience poverty at some point in their lives, but instead we see it as some sort of exceptional state, something that we wouldn't assume we would go through. Have you encountered poverty in your own life?
No, not. I mean, when I was in graduate school, I guess I might have been considered in poverty, but no, I've been lucky enough not to have really experienced poverty. But that's a really important point, is that the way that we often think about poverty is in a kind of static way. How many folks are poor in a particular year? And a lot of my work and research has looked over the course of a lifetime and has asked this question of, what's the lifetime chances of somebody experiencing poverty? And if we do that, it actually is a normative event. So a majority of Americans at some point during their adulthood will experience a year below the poverty line. Roughly 60% of people and 3/4 of people will experience poverty or near poverty. So the idea that poverty is something that happens to somebody else and not to me is really a misperception. Actually, poverty will strike a majority of Americans. And that implies a different way to think about this issue. So again, going back to what I was talking about earlier, we often think about it as, oh, it's somebody else, it's not me. Actually, poverty affects us all in one way or another. And we can talk about, different ways in which that plays out during our next, 45 minutes or so. But I think that would probably be another important message here, is this idea that poverty is actually quite widespread and affects us all. And we need to think about it from that perspective.
And one point related to that, again, about these perspectives we have about who's poor, is that a lot of poverty occurs spatially in places we wouldn't necessarily assume that it does. And I've actually done some research on the deconcentration of poverty in urban areas and moving to suburban and rural areas. Well, rural areas have been poor for a long time, but moving to that middle space. What do you think is different about suburban poverty from urban poverty, and sort of how we shape these narratives and how we think we understand poverty?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. And we deal in one of the chapters with the idea that, the way that we often perceive poverty or kind of picture poverty is that of inner city poverty, and poverty particularly that strikes non-whites, folks of color. And as you point out, actually, poverty is quite widespread. And so there are more people today that are in poverty in suburban areas than in central cities. And some of the deepest rooted poverty is in rural areas. Now, the question of how does that poverty differ? I think what you find in inner city areas and in remote rural areas is you're more likely to find deep-seated poverty than you are, say, in some of the suburban areas, where it might be more transitory and people experience a year of poverty but then get back on their feet. So I think that's a difference. But again, people are often surprised when you say, actually, there are more numbers of people in poverty in suburban areas than in central cities. That sort of like goes against the image that a lot of people have of who's in poverty.
But speaking of that image and talking about the Metro Dallas area, which is where many of us are, working from. So a lot of that poverty, or a lot of those patterns of poverty are due in part to gentrification in the inner core, right? And this redevelopment of inner cities that's actually displaced a lot of people into suburban areas. And we see this a lot in the Metro Dallas area and even further out. What is different about the way that suburban areas can deal with poverty and can manage poverty as opposed to urban ones? Is there a capacity difference? Is there a spatial difference? Is there, we talk about apartment associations, right? And suburban areas generally don't have as many apartments. What are some of the key differences in managing that poverty?
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, you're bringing up a really good issue in that, suburban areas are different than in central cities. And I'm not exactly sure how, what some of the ways in which poverty in suburban areas can be addressed differently than, say, poverty in the central city. Certainly the spatial dynamics are different, but I guess again, I would go back to this idea that, poverty in suburban areas is more likely to be transitory and, shorter term than it is in central cities. But you raise a really good issue, which is, and when we think about the issue of homelessness, the idea of gentrification really comes into play here. And that's an issue of, again, I would sort of fall back on this idea that this is a structural failing, and the failing is not enough affordable housing for folks. So somebody's going to lose out. And we can talk. I've got a nice analogy, I think, that kind of ties some of this together that we can talk about in a little bit about musical chairs. And I know, Hannah, you've read the book and gone through it twice, so you know all of these things. But when we think about homelessness, ultimately, I think it's a question of just really a lack of affordable housing for everybody who needs it.
So I want to push you on that a little bit. First, if you could talk about the musical chairs, because I think that's a really key point here, and I want us to engage with that.
Yeah, sure. So this is an analogy I've been using for a while, and it kind of gets at the question of, do we want to focus on who loses out at the game, or do we want to focus on why the game produces losers in the first place? And those are two separate questions, and oftentimes we conflate the two of them. So here's the argument. Let's picture a game of musical chairs here on our Zoom meeting, and we've got let's say 8 chairs, and we've got 10 people playing. The music stops. Who loses out? Well, if we focus on who loses out at that game, then we can say, well, it's folks that maybe weren't as quick or agile. They were in a bad position when the music stopped. And those are all appropriate reasons for why those 2 people lost out. But if we step back and we say, wait a minute, the game is set up so that 2 people are going to lose out, then those individual characteristics only explain who loses out at the game, not why the game produces losers in the first place. And the reason there's losers in the first place is there's not enough chairs for everybody playing the game. And so to apply that to poverty, the argument that I make is that those who lose out, those who experience poverty, have less kind of characteristics that put them at a disadvantage. So folks with less education, folks of color, single parent families, all of these things put people at a disadvantage in terms of finding a decent paying job. But the fact that there aren't enough decent paying jobs has to do with a failure at the economic and the political levels. So we're playing a large scale version of musical chairs in this country where we've got more people playing than chairs available. And in this analogy, the chairs are jobs that can support a family, on a livable wage. So I think that that's a really important point, and it goes back to this idea of thinking about poverty from a structural failing rather than as an individual failing. The individual failing helps us to explain, again, who loses out, but it doesn't explain why the game is producing losers in the first place.
So I think that's a great analogy. And when I read it and I actually read that part 3 times. 'Cause I went through it
Very
2.5 times.
Very good.
And the first time I read it, I was really struck, and I thought that that is a really great analogy. And I do still think it fits a lot of the narrative, but I don't think it fits all of the narrative, because I also believe that there are larger conversations we need to be having about who specifically the chairs are being kept away from. Because even if we talk about, let's say, affordable housing, which the book doesn't get into spatial policy as much as social policy, but even if we talk about rapidly building more housing, we still don't have protections for people who are going to be discriminated against in that housing. So we could have enough housing, and we know from research over decades that landlords might still not want to rent to people who are LGBTQ, to Black women with children, to all of these different demographic groups. So there's still going to be certain populations that face that marginalization. So in writing this book and kind of demystifying some of these myths, how do we also address the systemic racism and these systemic issues that do impact certain demographic groups more than others?
Yeah, and I think, what you're talking about, I would sort of put that also in the category of structural failing. We've got systemic discrimination and all these things that you're talking about, and that's part of kind of the structure of the game. Right, the game is preventing certain players from competing on an even level, and so what we need to do is, we might think of this as maybe altering the rules of the game so that it includes folks that have been traditionally left out. So absolutely, there's no question about it that, we've been in a time over the last few years where we've seen these patterns of systemic discrimination, particularly in terms of race and ethnicity, but also in terms of other characteristics as well. And so we really need policies that, as you say, not only provide enough housing, but make sure that people have access to that housing.
So in your, musical chairs example, do you think there's a place for, race specific or gender specific or sexuality specific equity there too? Because when I imagine a game of musical chairs, right, the chairs just being taken away from everybody. But it almost seems like some chairs, some groups might have more chairs taken away, or it might not just be that their chair's taken away, it's also that one of the chairs is broken, right? It's almost like it's almost like a colorblind policy sort of idea, where we know that those tend to play out in non-colorblind ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. It's interesting, I'm actually in the middle of I'm working with a friend of mine up in Wisconsin, and we're trying to develop this musical chairs analogy into a online game simulation. And I think this would be really, and we could factor in some of these things that you're talking about. And what we will have are, we will have sort of the number of players representing kind of the characteristics of the population. And we'll show how, how some of these things play out in a kind of in a real time kind of simulation. So I think that's absolutely. I agree with everything you've been saying about this. And while I'm rambling on, I'll say something else about a simulation that I think is actually trying to, again, change the mindset of people. So, I've done all this research and published things in papers and books and things like that, and that's fine and good. But I really wanted to be able to take this research and put it in the hands of folks in the general population. And so what I did was create a website in which, on that website, is a poverty risk calculator. And what people can do is they can go to that website, and everything's accessible and free and everything. They can go to that website, they could put in a couple of their characteristics, and they can actually see what their 5, 10, and 15-year risk of poverty is. And for a lot of people, it's not a trivial number. And that's a way of taking our research. And Hannah, you're in this research game too. You're at a university, and trying to take it and bring it out into the general public so that people can use that and think about that research. So that's another, I know I'm going off on a little tangent here, but
No, I think that's good, because I think you did write a very there's a request for the website that you just mentioned, by the way, if you want to take a
yeah,
second and
it's
put it in
just
the
if
chat.
you just if you just type in confronting poverty, it'll pop up on Google right away. It's the whole thing is confrontingpoverty.org.
And you know what, I think that that's a really important point, because what you and your co-authors have done is write a very accessible book. And a lot of conversations that are happening around these issues are happening in academic spaces where they're not so accessible. And there's also pushback in legislative spaces, unfortunately now, about some of these conversations that we have in academic spaces. How do we bridge those gaps? How do we get these sort of things to the people who need to know them, especially now when there are all of these kind of tense political conversations happening around race and other things related to that? How do we get this to who it needs to get to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I even think what we're doing now is a good example of that, of, talking about these issues. And, this isn't, the kinds of things we're dealing with is not rocket science. This isn't like, really abstract. I think the important point is to make these ideas accessible. So take the musical chairs. I think a lot of people can relate to that, can say, I can see how, there are a certain number of people that are going to lose out. And, the question of who loses out and why the game produces losers in the first place are separate kinds of things. So I think there's lots of ways to think about that. Certainly with social media now, we have, many kind of venues to get the word out. And again, what I tried to do with this Confronting Poverty website is make it very, very accessible so that lots of people can go there. They can use the poverty risk calculator, but they can also learn about other issues. There's a discussion guide and a facts and myths and a research section. And actually, it's amazing how much this is being used in the last couple of years. So we've had more than 1 million people from over 200 countries. It's being used in like high school AP classes and college courses. So I think it's a really good example of taking our research and making it accessible. And we can think about many other ways, I think, to do that.
Speaking of media, which does, you do get into a little bit in the book, what's the role of media in creating these sort of meta narratives about poverty?
Yeah, so one of my co-authors, Heather Bullock, is a social psychologist, and she kind of deals with that in some of the chapters. And it's certainly true that the media tends to perpetuate some of these stereotypes and myths. Not totally. I mean, I don't want to at all bash against the media, because I think they many times do a very good job of bringing these issues to the fore. But if you do look at it systematically, you do find that, for example, poverty or welfare use is often depicted as folks that are of color, folks that are not white. If you look at images of long-term poverty, you'll often see certain images of folks of color. And so, and it turns out that one of the myths is that, poverty is really about folks who are non-white. Well, it turns out that 2/3 of the poor in this country put down the category white in terms of their race and ethnicity. So most people in poverty actually are white, but on the other hand, you're at a much greater risk of experiencing poverty if you're non-white. And both of those things are correct. Both of those facts are correct. And that's a more kind of subtle reading of the research rather than just sort of these myths. So I think, I think the media, has played a role in perpetuating these things. But again, the media can also, one of the things that I found that media are interested in is if you have something that goes counter to the common sort of understanding, because that's kind of newsworthy. instead of just repeating the same thing over and over, if you have something that runs counter to that, a lot of times people will pick up on that. And that's kind of what we're doing here with the issue of poverty, is saying actually the common understanding of poverty is in many ways incorrect.
So you focus a lot in your book on social policy making to resolve some of these issues, right? And understanding that they're institutional in nature.
Mm-hmm.
It gives a pretty heavy hand to the government to resolve a lot of these problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what we know from, in related to our social welfare and safety net programs currently, is that they also come with a lot of monitoring. They come with a lot of administrative burdens. They come with a lot of these other pieces that are not necessarily good or comfortable for people and don't necessarily protect the rights of those who are in poverty and need vital access to food or other sorts of things. What's the role of voluntary associations or the nonprofit sector, right? So MDHA is a nonprofit. What's the role of these sort of organizations in working on poverty and confronting some of the social dilemmas that you've brought up here, and even enabling the social policies that you'd like to see?
Yeah. So first of all, two things with that, because that's an interesting point that you're raising. And what's kind of, what's interesting right now in this period of time is people are talking about the idea of a universal basic income or a child allowance. The idea here is providing folks with a certain amount of monthly benefit in terms of raising children or just existing on. And that idea gets rid of all this kind of monitoring. It's like you get the monthly amount, so there is no monitoring basically involved in that. So it's an interesting idea, because we have been, in this country, we've been very steeped in the idea that you don't get something for nothing. We're going to make sure that you're spending that money right, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that's the first point. In terms of,
I just want to pause you for a second, because the UBI wouldn't necessarily get to some of the hardest hit folks, just like the COVID checks, right? The pandemic checks didn't actually get to some of the people who don't have bank accounts, who don't have, there are still burdens to accessing those things.
Sure. And there are ways to kind of figure this out. I mean, European countries have actually had a child allowance for decades. So if you're in France or Germany or wherever, and you have a child under 18, you get a basic monthly kind of stipend to help raise that child. And that's one of the reasons why the poverty rates in European countries are so much lower than they are in the United States, is because they're more proactive in focusing on folks. But sure, there are always kind of those issues. But if we had a universal basic income of, say, $12,000, $15,000 a year, that's going to help a lot of people that are either in poverty or near poverty. I mean, there's no question about that. In terms of the issue of nonprofits, absolutely. I mean, one of the strengths of our country is that we do have a lot of nonprofit organizations that are actively involved in addressing some of these issues. And the idea there is that nonprofits on a community level know their community much better than the feds know those folks. And so there absolutely, in all of this, is a role for nonprofits and community engagement. We talk a little bit about the idea of community organization and community development as an important strategy for dealing with poverty on more of a micro level. So I think all of those things are really key.
So I want to push you on that, though, because there are also concerns about nonprofits lacking accountability, transparency, not being as connected to their neighborhoods as they should be, right? So, is there, I guess I'm asking, is there a best model, right? Or is it a mixture of models? What's the best way to really address this?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, I think maybe it would be a mixed model. I think you can point to really successful nonprofits, and you can point to ones that are not accountable for what you're saying. So it's hard to really have an answer of the best practice there. Maybe you have an answer.
No, I think it's validating, right? I think we have a lot of attendees here, and thank you everybody for being here today.
Absolutely.
A lot of people in the trenches And it's
Absolutely.
frustrating sometimes that there's this pushback of like, well, you're not doing it right and you're not doing it right. And
Yeah.
it's,
I
I think it's
think
validating to know nobody really knows how to
y-
do it.
yeah, and I think the other thing that you often find with sort of nonprofit organizations is they're often not talking to each other. They're kind of and they're not working together, and that's often raised as a problem in terms of this particular area. And I don't have a really good answer for that. So.
So going back to the housing issue, and there are a lot of nonprofits who are actually really essential in providing those kind of connective resources. What do we need to see happen, spatially in terms of housing that can complement the, jobs and income related issues? Are
Yeah,
there,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, they're one of the, when we talk about in kind of the later chapters, some of the strategies for dealing with poverty, um, we talk about this idea that there needs to be greater access to particular uh, social kind of resources, and those would include, one of those includes affordable housing. What we've seen over the last 40-50 years in the United States, and folks that are watching this, I'm sure, are quite aware of this, is that housing has become more and more has become more and more not affordable. There's less affordable housing today than there has been in the past. So, if you're living particularly if you're living on certain areas in the East and West Coast, if you're living in Boston or New York or San Francisco, there's just no way you can afford it unless you're really making a lot of money. So we need to, yeah, and over this past 40 or 50 years, the government has really gotten out of the role of affordable housing. And I think we need to have a much more active role in terms of both the federal government and the state government in encouraging and building more affordable housing. It just seems like that's key, and there are different ways of thinking about how we could accomplish that. But again, I think that unless we have that, we're going to have folks that are experiencing homelessness, and are one paycheck away from experiencing homelessness.
And in our current affordable housing models, we focus a lot on decentralization, on not having like the old public housing models that we used to have in the 60s, 70s. Instead, moving towards the voucher model, right? And private folks being able to rent to people with vouchers. Do you think that there's a larger value to more social housing and public housing that's governmental in nature? Because going back to the idea of poorly understood, right? We have a lot of pushback in this country culturally around governmental efforts, specific governmental efforts to provide social resources such as housing. There's a lot of pushback. And take New York City, for example. There's a lot of solid pushback against NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority. And that's, a lot of it is very valid. So how do we engage with that, with creating more affordable housing?
Mm-hmm. I do think we are in a period of, a lot of times these things kind of go in cycles, and I do think we're in a period of time where we're going to see actually more kind of proactive government efforts in terms of some of these issues. So I think that there needs to be a role for the federal government in terms of affordable housing and things like that. There also needs to be encouragement in the private market as well. So it's not just an either or question, but there's no question that we don't have enough affordable housing for folks who need it, and we need to we need to address that. But again, I do think that it's interesting with the new Biden administration and sort of the emphasis on things like thinking about a child allowance and thinking about a universal basic income and thinking about talking about housing issues. I think there's more of an there's more of an emphasis now, and will probably continue in the future upon this, which is really very positive, I think.
And do you think these solutions should be federal in nature, or are they best done at the local or state level?
I think that, I think there is definitely more of a role for the federal government than has been in the last 40 or 50 years. I think there certainly is a role for the state and local levels as well. But, if we go back and we think about, go back to the book, we have a couple chapters where we say, let's compare poverty in the United States with other countries. It turns out the United States is at the very extreme end in terms of poverty. We have the most poverty of any of the OECD countries. We have the most inequality of these countries. And the question is, well, why is that? And one of the main reasons is because the government does so little to help folks in need here. We take this position of you're on your own. You don't rely on others. You don't turn to the government. Well, that hasn't been working. It's like the proof is in the pudding. We have the highest poverty rates of any of these countries. These other countries, make the effort to really address some of these issues. And, it's actually smart economic policy to invest in people. It's smart economic policy not to have children in poverty. So one of the things that I think is important in the book that we mentioned is I did with a graduate student here a study on what is the actual economic cost of childhood poverty in America. Because again, we often think, oh, well, this doesn't affect me. I'm sorry, but why bother? So what we did is we used the latest evidence latest research to look at the fact that if children are in poverty, you have higher healthcare costs, you have less productivity when they become adults, and you have higher rates of incarceration and criminal justice costs. And we factored all those in, and we came up with a figure of that in 2015, childhood poverty cost the United States conservatively slightly over $1 trillion. That was about 28% of the entire federal budget. So to say we're not paying for this is totally wrong. What we're doing is we're paying on the back end of the problem rather than on the front end of the problem. And it's always more expensive to pay for something on the back end of the problem. The other thing that we show in this study is that for every dollar we spend reducing childhood poverty, we would save between $7 and $12 down the road. So not only is addressing poverty and homelessness the morally right thing to do, but it's also economically the smart thing to do as well.
So when it comes to homelessness specifically, how much background do you have in this specific issue?
I really don't, I don't want to claim to be an expert on homelessness. I mean, I've clearly, done a lot of work on poverty in general and aspects of poverty. And I guess the way that I see homelessness is as an extreme sort of category within that larger category of poverty. That, if you don't have if you're out on the street or you're in a shelter, you really are in a tough situation. And so I think and there's lots of people that have done, lots of really good work and on homelessness, and certainly MDHA, is focused on this issue of homelessness and knows this probably much, much better than I do. So I don't want to claim any expertise on specifically on homelessness, but I think a lot of the issues are certainly related to the wider issues of poverty. So, if you're homeless, you have all I just mentioned, health kind of issues. I know, Hannah, you've done some work on environmental kind of issues and environmental justice, which is another really important issue here. So yeah.
Yeah, because I think that when it comes to homelessness, right, it's not just the extreme forms of poverty. It's also all of these, going back to these systemic and institutional factors. It's falling into every single one of those gaps as well. So it's living in poverty, but then it's also, being someone who has a criminal record who couldn't get housing because of their criminal record, or couldn't get a better job because of their criminal record. So it's all of these other gaps that we have in the system combined And then getting people out of homelessness means addressing every single one of those.
Right.
Someone with a drug issue, or people as they're experiencing longer bouts of homelessness deal with a lot more mental health issues, even if they didn't have them when they started. It becomes a deteriorating state. So it's dealing with all of those gaps and those holes together with poverty. And so
That's
getting out of that.
Yeah, definitely. And another issue here is, I don't know if folks have probably seen this, but the Federal Reserve comes out with a study every year, and what they ask people is, if you had a $500 emergency, would you be able to cover that with cash? Do you have enough cash on hand to cover that? And it turns out for this past year, 37% of the population said they would not have $500 on hand to cover an emergency. What that means is that there's so many people right on that borderline of falling, into poverty and possibly falling into homelessness. So there are a lot of people that, that are in that position. So yeah, I mean, and that's the other thing that we talk about, and I've talked about in other work, is that, one of the things about poverty is that, it's really people living on the edge, and any little thing can just push you over into homelessness, having a car breakdown or getting sick, or all kinds of things that people are just maybe barely making it, and one little thing can just cause them to go over.
So what do we need to see more of around these issues to create change?
Well,
and I know, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, I mean, the first thing is, what we really need, we need to think about this issue differently. We need a different paradigm, because the paradigm that we've had, that so many people, and you talk to people, and so many people fall back on this individual failing. Well, if you just would work hard enough, if you just get a job, if you just be more motivated, that would solve the problem. Well, that's not going to solve the problem, because the problem is structural. So we need to have a real change in the paradigm. We need to understand poverty as a structural issue, and we need to understand that poverty is an issue that affects us all. It's like that cost of childhood poverty study that I was talking about. That affects us all. It's not like we're not paying for this. We're paying for higher healthcare costs. We're paying for incarceration. We're paying for an economy that's not as productive as it could be. So we all wind up paying for this. So the first thing we need to do, and I'm sure folks, watching this are very attuned to this, we need a different paradigm for understanding poverty. Then once we have that, I think we can move forward with some of these solutions that are will be more effective, because they're dealing with the fact that the game is producing losers and providing more chairs for the number of players playing the game. So what would that be? I mean, it would be lots of things that, it would be things like, getting the minimum wage up to a livable wage. That's structural. There are a lot of people that are working, they're working really hard, but they're just not getting ahead because the jobs don't pay anything. So, getting wages up to a livable wage would be, as a structural kind of thing. And there's lots of other, kind of programs and things that we talk about that are designed to get more chairs for everybody who's playing the game.
And speaking of, actually creating change, right? You do talk a little bit about the decision-making power, right? That people who are in poverty have very little decision-making power when it comes to getting out of poverty. It's actually a lot of the people who aren't in poverty, who haven't experienced poverty, who are the decision makers and who have that agency around, the systems around them. How do we bridge that gap?
Well, if I had the answer to that, I mean, that's one of the things that, that you and I and everybody watching, I'm certainly has run into, is how do we get decision, folks that are in the position of making decisions to really change their perspective on this. And, I guess, the best that we can do is to present the evidence, to present, solid work that addresses these misperceptions, and to say, probably the strongest argument that I can think is that it's in all of our economic self-interest to address this issue. It's in nobody's self-interest to have children growing up in poverty. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any economic sense. So I think that message is just really, really strong. And again,
can we move past that though? Can we move past a self-serving argument? Because I think we got here because of a self-serving argument, right? We got here because of rugged individualism and this idea that, what you think and how you feel individually is really, the way the world is. And maybe appealing to that argument isn't the best way to structurally push change.
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of disagree. My perspective has always been, let's use as many arguments as we can. Okay. So I think one argument that, like I'm in the School of Social Work, so we're very much attuned to social justice, inequities, these kinds of things. I think that those are all important arguments, the value kind of arguments. But I do think that self-interest is another important argument to make. So it's not a question of either or. As I said, not only is addressing childhood poverty the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. Both of those arguments are important. So I don't want to, I get your point that, yeah, this has kind of led us into, self-interest has led us down this road for sure. But perhaps self-interest can play a role in leading us out of this this quagmire that we've been in.
Is there a different kind of space that we need to be in the long term to address some of these issues?
Like, what do you mean?
I guess a more communal one, a more empathetic one, right? Something that's more connective, relational, rather than just you yourself are probably better off if.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you raise a really good point. I had a book a few years ago focusing on the American dream, and the American dream to a large extent is about the individual. It's about how am I going to do? Am I going to have a good life? And I think that, again, that has been part of our problem in the United States, is that, we're very sort of focused on our own individual sort of well-being. And I do think we need to have a more communal kind of a sense of basically what we're talking about here is a collective responsibility. It is what responsibility do I have to somebody else? Where is my responsibility? So here, Hannah, is an interesting point that research has looked at, and that is in those societies that are more racially homogeneous, like Sweden, Norway, and so on, they tend to have a much more generous social safety net than societies that are more racially heterogeneous, like the United States. One of the reasons people say is that when people look the same as I do, they're more likely to feel a connection. They're more likely to feel this collective responsibility. But when people look different, I'm less likely to feel that collective responsibility. And I think that is an interesting idea. And I think that has worked against us thinking collectively, that we have folks from all around the world. And, we are not racially homogeneous, and we're becoming more heterogeneous in the future. And that has oftentimes worked against us seeing our collective interest.
It also creates factionalism,
Absolutely.
Right? And then we have fights over resources as opposed to seeing everybody as essential to the resource disbursement.
Absolutely. And certainly I think some of the pushback that we've been seeing, in the Trump years, this sort of kind of white backlash is reflective of this idea. So absolutely. And so the big question again is, how do we get beyond that? How do we see beyond that and realize that we're in this together? We have a collective responsibility. And, I mean, do you have some ideas on this one? Because this is $1 million question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are definitely interrelated systems here that we need to address. One of them actually being that, you know, and we didn't discuss this much, and the book doesn't get into this much, but how we educate children. So this book is really, you know, for adults, people who've already grown up, who've already kind of made their minds about who they feel comfortable with or don't feel comfortable with. But every day in this country, we do have a lot of heterogeneity in our public schools, and even our private schools increasingly. But we haven't really thought about how we teach children about poverty, because that's where they start to have these ideas about moral failings, right? And not understanding that their best friend might not be able to afford something they can, right? We haven't had those conversations at the kid level yet. And we do need to have those conversations. We need to start raising children and raising future Americans who are going to think about these issues with a more collectivist mindset. Because in the classroom, they know these are your people, right? Like, this is your family. It doesn't really matter what they look like. You know, if you have a group project, if you have to work together as a unit. But then they leave the classroom and they end up back in their, you know, smaller spaces, their more homogeneous spaces, whether it's, you know, racial, economic, or although those often come together, but even professional, you know, tiny spaces. They go back to their spatial small spaces, right? Their small suburban area, or, you know, things like that, their neighborhood, and they shrink their views of what the world is, even though in the classroom, they're much more, you know, complicated and complex. And I think that's one of the things we have to, you know, write a poorly understood, but for kids, for a way that we can teach kids. That I think is really the future. I also have 2 little ones, so this is just something I think about all the time.
Nice, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're not doing a good enough job, you know, addressing this where it starts, not just systemically where it starts, but also educationally where it starts.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's interesting that you bring that up, because there's a lot of, like in St. Louis, where I'm here right now, and there's been a lot of pushback about school districts that are trying to introduce issues of, you know, discrimination and, you know, not critical race theory, but issues around those. And there's been all this pushback about that, not from the students, but from the parents, you know, in some of these school districts. But I think you're absolutely right. We need poorly understood for sort of you know, the middle school and the high school students. And that's why I said I'm really one of the things.
Elementary and preschool students.
Yeah, absolutely,
I have a 3-year-old and an almost 7-year-old, and I taught them exclusively about homelessness, and they totally get it. You know, it makes sense to kids. When you explain to kids, I sat down with my daughter and a calculator, and we calculated if you made $7.25 an hour, which is minimum wage in Texas, and you worked 40 hours a week, would you be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment? We just sat down together. She's learning math anyway, and we did it together, and you can't. And if you teach that to a 7-year-old, then they go their whole life understanding that that's true. And then when they're 37, you don't have to explain it to them then, because they already learned that in, you know, elementary school math.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I do I mean, you're more in touch with this, but I do think that the curriculums are starting to change and starting to recognize some of these things. Another really interesting tool that some of the listeners might not be aware of is there's a great website by Amy Glassmeyer at MIT, and it's called the Living Wage Calculator. And what it does is you can go to any area. So you can go to Dallas and you can put in, you can see what a living wage would be given the housing costs there, given other costs.
How many kids you have.
Absolutely. And then almost in every area, in fact, in every area, the minimum wage is way below what a living wage should be. But you can see what the difference is in any location in the United States. So it's a really good tool that's out there.
Yeah. So I'd love to take some questions now. I see we have a few. So I'm just going to jump in with one. Okay. So, so Dr. Banks, you mentioned about other countries having, I'm sorry, Dr. Rank, sorry, somebody wrote Dr. Banks. Dr. Rank, it's just, you know, when you're reading something, you know something in your head, but as you're reading it, you're just saying it. So Dr. Rank, you mentioned that other countries have lower levels of poverty, do they also have a larger welfare state, or are there nonprofits there as well? Is it mostly the state that takes care of this?
It is mostly the state. So they have a much more robust kind of social safety net kind of thing. But also these other countries, when you think about it, the United States is an outlier, not only in terms of poverty, but we're the only OECD country that does not have national health care coverage, that does not have kind of national childcare and making childcare affordable. So not only do we not have a robust safety net, we don't have these other things that all these other countries basically provide. So that's the real difference. And other countries don't have the to a large extent the system of nonprofits that we have in the United States.
So someone said, sometimes I think addressing poverty is not a physical thing, but a mental thing. We seem to address it by passing laws that basically say, you know, we should do this or we should do that. Or, you know, especially when it comes to homelessness, there's outlawing panhandling, things like that. But really we need to re-educate the community that poverty has been around since even biblical times. Is that, you know, is that temporal conversation, right? So we've had a social conversation, right, about social policies. We've had a spatial conversation, but what about the temporal conversation? Talking about the fact that this is constant, right? Over time, poverty is just, it's a part of who we are. We have built into so many systems to give charity or to engage in some sort of taxation and then redistribution.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I would say a couple of things on that. First of all, yes, we've had poverty since the beginning of this country, and in fact going back, you know, thousands of years. However, you know, sometimes people say, and this is one of the myths we take on in the book, that poverty is simply inevitable. That, you know, with the quote from the Bible about, you know, you'll have the poor with you always. Well, poverty may be with us for long periods of time, but we can do a lot to reduce the extent of poverty. And just the example I was giving of other countries. Some countries have poverty rates as low as 3 to 4%, whereas our poverty rates tend to be around 15%. So, you know, can we get rid of all poverty? No, but we can certainly make a huge dent in reducing poverty. But the other point that I would make with this question is, which is a really good one, is you know, these arguments that we're having, for example, about the argument of the deserving and the undeserving poor. The deserving poor are those who are deserving of some help. The undeserving poor are those who are not deserving of help. And we often think of most of poverty as the undeserving poor. Well, that argument has been going on for hundreds of years. The English Poor Laws in 1604 were based on this idea of the deserving and the undeserving. So the arguments we're having today in terms of social policy often have a long history behind them.
So coronavirus, COVID, I think we really have to talk about that. On the one hand, you know, we might see a lot of changes in poverty because so many people lost their jobs or their businesses. On the other hand, we also saw an infusion of a lot of resources for people who weren't able to access them and rethinking our hardest hit communities. Where do you think this is going to go in the future?
So this is a perfect example of showing that poverty is structural. The pandemic has nothing to do with individual failing, right? I mean, this happened. It was a structural failing. And in fact, the government actually did a lot to help people. They addressed it. So I think that this, you know, this illustrates both of those points that I've been making. You know, another period of time where we had a huge structural failing and we saw a response of the federal government was the Great Depression. The Great Depression resulted in, you know, millions of people being unemployed through no fault of their own. And the government said, you know what, we have a role to play here. We have a role to get people back going and working again. And so, so I think that, you know, this is a, you know, if there's a silver lining, it illustrates the importance of programs and policies that directly address people's poverty. I think this is a good example of that. And I hope that this idea will continue. And as I said, the idea of a child allowance is now starting in July and it will go for a year. And that actually is estimated to potentially reduce childhood poverty by about 40%, which is pretty significant. But it's only in place for a year, and then it will need to pass Congress and so on. And so we'll see what happens with that in a year's time.
So one of the arguments of your book, Dr. Rank, is that poverty is most commonly experienced in sort of these short and cyclic experiences.
Yeah.
What about intergenerational poverty?
Yeah.
Deep, again, that temporality, right? That long-term poverty. How do we address that?
Right. And that's a kind of a much more difficult issue. So that's exactly right. There are different kinds of poverty that is out there. Most people who experience poverty do so for a fairly short period of time, maybe a year or two. They've lost a job or they've gotten sick, but then they get back on their feet, and they may not be that far above the poverty line, but they're out of poverty, and then something else might happen to them again. So for a lot of people, poverty is fairly fluid. You might move in and out of it. But absolutely, there's a percentage of those who are in poverty, perhaps about maybe 10 to 15%, that are there for long periods of time, and that part of that is generational, and that is a very difficult issue. I think again, though, that the opportunity structure for those folks is just really not there. So we have to think about opening up the opportunity structure, and we have to think about policies that maybe are specific to long-term generational poverty. That is, kind of things you were talking about with education and kids, and issues of, for example, the Head Start program and things like that try to build people's assets and their human capital. But that's I think a very, very difficult issue to deal with.
And reparations can help address.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's a book that I was just starting to read on reparations. And yeah, I mean, I think that could definitely do a lot for folks who, have experienced, long-term racial discrimination over this period of time.
As a professor of social work, it seems that empathy is probably key in some of this. How do we cultivate empathy?
I think that is. Empathy is really key. And it's sort of, when I say in the classes that I teach, I use this in a different context, but one of the things I say is that a really important lesson is the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to be able to try to put yourself in their position and try to imagine what it's like for them. And that's what empathy is about trying to understand somebody's situation that's different than yours. And, how do we increase that? I mean, I think it's just, the best thing we can do is making people aware of some of these vast inequities and things that just are wrong. It would be one thing if we were a poor country and we really were strapped in terms of resources, but we are the wealthiest country in the world, and yet we have the most poverty. We can do something about this. We have the ability to change this. And I think it is that we're lacking the empathy, we're lacking the political will to change this, and that's what we really need to address and to sort of build up, as the question is sort of implying.
Just going to look through these. Are you familiar with the book Evicted?
Oh, sure. I got it. I have it right here. I put the camera on my bookshelves over here. Yeah, yes, very, very
That's
familiar
great.
with it.
So we have a question here. Based on the book Evicted, it seems that apartment owners would benefit from working with folks instead of evicting them. Without public policy, how can we keep from hamstringing those who are most deeply affected, such as single women with children, particularly Black women? What's the win-win here? How do we get, I guess, apartment owners or people who have a right to collect rent and to, kind of be engaged in that commodity, but also to get what they need, but then also not to be engaging in these constant, evictions. And part of Desmond's book, right, is about how common eviction is nowadays. That didn't used to be common. It used to be kind of this big neighborhood, wow event. And now eviction is just constant. How do we find that space?
Yeah, and expression that the questionnaire is asking, how do we make this a win-win, is really key. So I don't, offhand, I don't have a particular answer to that. I think that, we have to have policies that that support both. If somebody is a landlord, they are, rightfully, expect to have rent and things like that. But how can we have a situation where we support them, but we also reduce the extent of evictions? And I'm not sure. Hannah, do you have an idea on that one?
I think that housing, one of the things that's true about housing, which isn't true about a lot of other commodities, especially when it comes to social policy making, housing is such a unique commodity. One of the reasons it's so unique is because we build housing to last, but our actual sorting and residential behaviors don't match the way that we think about housing. So, for example, we kind of have these economic models in our mind of, a single person might live in a 1-bedroom apartment. And then as they get married, they might move to a 2-bedroom, or they might stay in their 1-bedroom. They might have a couple kids and get a bigger apartment or a home. But then after a few years, they'll downsize from the home, and then we'll keep sorting people through housing. But we don't have that in reality. People hold on to their homes, even when, they might be one elderly person living in a home and they don't want to give it up. People very often can't move out of an apartment because they can't find, a single family detached home in the right area or something like that, right? Like, so a lot of our sorting is really off. But in most other commodities, take food, for example, right? People will access the food that they want to eat. And the more interest there is in certain foods, the more the market kind of flexes towards those foods, and they're much more easily consumed. Whereas housing isn't a consumed commodity in the same way, or a used commodity in the same way. Cars are also different, right? Like, people use cars and then they die, they end, they're over. Homes aren't like that. In fact, in this country, we hold on to housing so strongly because we don't want it to be like that. We want to hold on to a nest egg, right? We want to hold on to our property values. So that becomes much more complicated when it comes to being a landlord, where the sole purpose of that position is to get as much material wealth out of the home. We don't really have a lot of incentives for landlords to not just evict people. In their minds, it would seem to make sense. If I can't get rent from this person, they should have to leave, and I should be able to use this commodity to its, maximum usage and get the next person in. That's sorting, right? Keep sorting people. That's kind of the economic model that we assume. In reality, that's not people's real lived behavior, right? They want to stay in their home, even though that 1 month something might have happened and they couldn't make the rent payment. They want to be settled, right? Housing is actually a settlement tool. It's not a sorting tool. So we need to kind of, I think, rethink how we think about housing, how we think about settlement practices, and how we think about who gets control in that relationship. Because if all the control is on the landlord side, we can't expect them to act any differently. There's no reason for them to act differently if they want to utilize the commodity that they own at its, highest value. It's like, it doesn't make sense logically. But then when we think about housing as a settlement tool and not a sorting tool, a way that people are settled and live, and that's, kind of the goal, then we think about more protections on their end, because ultimately, again, with that collectivist mindset, we're all better off when there isn't that massive sorting, when there isn't that constant shakeup of, you might come home one day, you don't know, you might get kicked out of your home. That's, that there's so many economic and social reasons to not have people living like that. So I think it's a lot more about, like this whole conversation, shifting our mindset, really rethinking our assumptions about, for whose good does something exist, or for whom which group are we servicing? Which group is most in need? What does poverty look like? What are bad experiences? How impactful are bad experiences, right? Like, we need to be rethinking a lot of this and reshaping our minds around these issues, which is why your book, is so important and so helpful. I I wanna ask if there's any, final thoughts that you have to leave us off on.
Well, I think that was very well put. I should start asking you questions. So, no, I just hope that that folks, I guess like people who are watching this, I think that the book is something that can be put to use, and not only for an individual's own refreshment on some of these issues, but for using these arguments when we engage with other people. I think it can be very useful. So I hope everybody, either checks it out at your library or, picks it up at your local bookstore or whatever. Because I think, it's these kind of discussions and talking about it, that's where it begins. So, I want to thank you for the excellent questions, and everybody watching. It's been really a pleasure to get to share some thoughts and ideas.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it back to our host now.
Wow, I am simply overwhelmed. This has been a tremendous conversation. We got more than we bargained for with both of these scholars, and there really is so much we can put into practice. I'm putting into the chat right now a link to our entire series. I would love for you to go to it. We have 3 more sessions in this series, which I hope you will all attend. There's a opportunity to sponsor it too. This is kind of spontaneous, but our next conversation is actually going to be about what the faith community can do. So it kind of goes to some of the questions that were asked today. Our 4th session is actually going to be about a book called Brave New Home, which talks exactly about what Dr. Hannah was talking about in terms of the fact that we need to break the mold. We have this myth in our country that you either live in an apartment or you live in a single family detached home. And of course, we know that that's a historical anomaly. That's not really true. That's maybe post-war, maybe slightly before that. And so this book, Brave New Home, really addresses a lot of those. And then our final session will be with the Dallas DA. We just confirmed the date for that, and that's going to be about how why you can't arrest your way out of homelessness. So I encourage all of you to join us for those sessions too. Thank you again, Dr. Rank. Thank you again, Dr. Leibovitz. I hope that everybody who attended will at least choose one person who didn't and tell them, go to MDHA's YouTube channel and watch. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care.